This week, I kept seeing the same photograph from the floods. Not the dramatic one, the man on the roof, the submerged street. The one that stayed with me was quieter. A family standing in front of their house with a water line drawn across it at chest height, looking at it the way you look at something that is technically still standing, but is actually gone. And I realized I had been reading the flood news wrong for years. Now, let me tell you where I stand, because this ends with an opinion. I think we in India have learned to read a disaster as a weather story and a body count, and almost never as what it actually is, which is a wealth story. But I also think the people in those photographs are extraordinary, rebuilding with a speed and a calm I honestly cannot imagine. And that rebuilding is exactly the thing that hides the real cost. That is what I want to spend the next few minutes on. Because the stakes this month were not abstract. The floods in the Northeast killed at least 50 people and pushed nearly 700,000 of them from their homes, with almost 300,000 sheltering in relief camps as I record this. Those are the numbers the news reads out to you. But there is a third number, and nobody ever reads it because nobody is counting it. And if you ask an ordinary person what a flood costs, they picture the rescue, the boats, the camps, the dramatic week on television. But you know what? That week is not really the disaster. The rescue ends, the water goes down, the cameras leave, and that is precisely the moment the real loss begins. A flood is not an event. It is a subtraction, and it is subtracted from the one place where most Indians keep almost everything they own. So here is what we are going to do. First, what a flood actually destroys, which is stranger than simple water damage. Then, why an Indian family's life savings are sitting in exactly the wrong place when the river starts to rise. And finally, the big one, why the help that does arrive is genuine and still does not fix the thing that broke. Fundamentals first. When a river takes a house, it is not really taking shelter. For most Indian families, the house is not where the wealth is kept. The house is the wealth, the single biggest thing they will ever own, built slowly over decades, often with no clear papers, no valuation, and no cover of any kind. And around it sits everything else that cannot run from water, the standing crop, the two buffaloes, the sewing machine, the small shop's entire stock, the tools that the whole family's trade depends on. And here is the number that quietly reflames everything. By the Reserve Bank's own household finance survey, roughly 3/4 of everything an average Indian family owns is physical, property and gold and the like, rather than money sitting in an account. Let me translate that. For most of this country, savings is not a balance you can move to safety in an afternoon. It is a thing with a fixed location, and that location is very often a floodplain. Now compare that to how a wealthier country tends to hold its money, spread across pensions and funds and insured deposits, things that exist mainly as numbers and simply cannot be drowned. When a flood hits a rich suburb, it damages property that was insured, paid for out of wealth that was never in the water. When a flood hits an Indian village, it does not merely damage the wealth, it deletes it. But that is only the first half of the problem, because destroying the asset is one thing. The second half is that almost nothing standing in that water was ever insured in the first place. See, India is at once one of the most flood-exposed countries on earth, and one of the least insured against it. By most estimates, fewer than one home in 20 in this entire country carries any insurance at all. Crop insurance reaches more people on paper, but at the exact moment the claim is needed most, the payout is often slow or partial or lost somewhere in the gap between what was promised and what actually arrives. So the asset drowns, and there is no second copy of it stored anywhere. The experts have a cold phrase for this: the protection gap, the share of a disaster's losses that no insurance ever covers. In wealthy countries, a large chunk of flood damage is insured and quietly paid back. In India, by most measures, the overwhelming majority of what a disaster destroys, often more than 9 in every 10 rupees of it, is simply absorbed by the family it happened to fall on. The rain is shared by the whole region. The bill is entirely private. And here is where it genuinely bothers me. We have quietly allowed relief to be mistaken for compensation, and the two are not the same thing at all. Relief is a tarpaulin, a food packet, a few thousand rupees paid out of kindness, and it keeps a family alive through the worst week. compensation would make that family whole again. One is a lifeline, the other is a ledger being balanced. We provide the first, generously and often bravely, and then we quietly call it the second, and we go home. Now, to be fair to the other side, none of this is because anyone is heartless, and it is not because relief is worthless. A country struck by this many disasters, this often genuinely cannot write a full check for every drowned house. The arithmetic for that does not exist. Relief is triage, and triage is exactly the right thing to do in the first week. The failure is not the tarpaulin at all. The failure is that the tarpaulin is where our thinking quietly stops. See, because the wealth is gone and the compensation never really comes, the family does the only thing that is left to do. It rebuilds on borrowed money. The house goes up again on a loan. The crop is resown on credit. The lost buffalo is replaced by a moneylender's advance. And so the flood, which lasted a single week, quietly becomes a debt that lasts a decade. The water leaves in days, the interest stays for years. And there is genuine progress here, honestly. India today has one of the more capable disaster response systems in the region. The warnings are better, the evacuations are faster, and that is a large part of why this month the toll, while tragic, was not many times worse. Far fewer people drowned in Indian floods than once did, and that is a real achievement, built patiently over decades. However, and it is a very large however, we have become genuinely excellent at saving lives, and barely started at saving livelihoods. We evacuate the family brilliantly, and then leave their entire net worth to drown behind them. Which brings us to the big one. The problem is not really the flood, and it is not even, in the end, the missing check. The problem is that we have built a system that treats a disaster purely as an emergency to be survived, when for the household, it is a financial event to be insured against. Floods are not about to become rarer. The one thing genuinely within our power to change is whether, once the water goes back down, a family finds itself merely soaked or finds itself ruined. And the strange part is that the tools for this already exist. There is a kind of cover called parametric insurance that does not argue with you about your drowned paperwork. It simply pays out the instant the river crosses a fixed, agreed level automatically to everyone inside the zone. There are schemes that insure a whole district's public assets in a single stroke. None of this is science fiction. It is already being done, in pieces, in places no richer than we are. So here is what actually shifts the loss of the family and onto something built to carry it. Cheap, automatic flood cover, bundled the way we once bundled bank accounts so that it reaches the people who could never afford to seek out an agent. Public buildings and standing crops insured by default so that the state's own rebuilding is paid for before the rain, not after. And a small, honest change in how we speak, where we stop announcing relief as though it had settled the debt. None of it is easy. All of it is far cheaper than rebuilding the very same village, by hand, every single year. And I will say the hopeful part plainly, because I believe it. Of all the disasters a country can be handed, a flood is among the most insurable of them. The water is predictable, the danger zones are already mapped, the underlying science is genuinely good. This is not a problem waiting on some distant miracle. It is a problem waiting on a decision, the decision to treat a family's wealth as something worth protecting before the rain, and not merely something to be mourned after it. Which brings me back to that photograph and the family standing in front of the house with the waterline drawn across its chest. I think I understand now what I was actually looking at. Not a damaged building, a lifetime of saving held in the one single form that cannot be carried upstairs, meeting the one force that always, reliably, comes back. The tragedy inside that picture was never only the water. It was everything the water had been allowed to reach. We have spent this video learning to see that third number, the wealth that no one counts, held in physical things, sitting uninsured directly in the path of a river that returns every single year and rebuilt each time on borrowed money. The dead we count, the displaced we count. The quiet erasure of everything a family spent 30 years slowly building, we have simply never learned how to add up. They say floodwater always finds the lowest ground. So, it turns out, does financial ruin, pooling exactly where the protection was thinnest to begin with. The least we can do In a country this full of rivers, you stop being surprised that the two keep arriving together and start building the quiet wall that was always cheaper than the rescue.